to say which of it is. Now, this two-stage model, as I say, I basically developed it in the 60s, and I was into another life career. And I've only gone back to the astronomy at Harvard in the last couple of years. And I watched other people arguing about this idea of mine, and I thought, somebody's going to figure this out. And I didn't know James yet. The first I came across was really Dan Dennett, who wrote a book in 1978 in which he states William James' argument and names it another name other than Jamesian, which I want to now call it. He called it Valerian, for reasons I can't explain to you, after the great poet Paul Valéry in France. Now, the others who've come up that I've found in my researches include the great mathematician Poincaré, a great scientist, Compton physicist, Karl Popper, the great philosopher, physicist and philosopher from Yale, Henry Margenau, and then the ones who are alive, Dan Dennett, Bob Kane, John Martin Fisher in California, Al Mealy at Florida. Al Mealy just got a $4.4 million grant from the Templeton Foundation, 4-year grant to study free will. The next 4 years, free will is going to be back on the philosophical map. Not that Mealy knows how to figure it out yet, but I'm hoping we will convince him that it's been figured out a long time ago by our William James. Steve Kosslyn, I mentioned, who's going to leave Harvard, myself, and Martin Heisenberg. Now, I put the date 2005 on myself because I don't want to claim I thought of it in 1965. You can find it in my notes and records, but I don't particularly need that. I only went public with it a few years ago when I started issuing my Information Philosopher web pages. Okay, every one of these 12 include two things: alternative possibilities generated by chance, and adequately determined evaluation of those possibilities or alternatives, which results in a will decision. So our goal is to think of this as two stages, and they're distinct. I would actually like to separate the word free from the word will, because to say the will is free, that really bothered John Locke. I guess I don't have my quote from him on this page. He said it isn't the will that's free, it's the man that's free. Because in those days, free meant libertine, totally uncontrolled, ridiculous. He said that's why we're in trouble. We use the language free will. No, we shouldn't be saying free will. Will is an act of determination. Anyway, I like to say first a free stage, then a will. First chance, then choice. Our thoughts come to us freely. They present themselves. Haven't you ever said to yourself, the idea just popped into my head? Ideas pop into our heads. Not all of us, maybe. Some people never think of anything new, maybe, but most of us do think of things. But our actions go from us. The ideas and thoughts come in, the actions and decisions go out. I'd like to say that as a figure to help you think about that. I believe we are the authors of our lives. Now, my website, as I mentioned, has 130 philosophers, including Bob Kane of the Oxford Handbook, Al Mealy, who has this giant grant. You'll also find 60 scientists from Laplace, of the great Laplace demon, who could, if he knew the positions and momenta of all the particles in the universe, he'd be able to totally predict the future. A perfect Newtonian view of the world and a perfectly deterministic view, down to a son of Werner Heisenberg. You probably know Heisenberg of the uncertainty principle or indeterminacy principle. His son is the leading neurogeneticist in Germany, and he wrote an essay in Nature magazine last May asking, is free will an illusion? A dead-on, head-on attack on Dan Wegner at Harvard. I've called Dan Wegner, I've emailed him and said, could I come talk to you about this? I'm swamped right now. But he is basically out to say, and I'll tell you a lot more about Heisenberg later, okay? So in the essay, Heisenberg challenged Dan Wegner. Ironically, Dan Wegner was just named the William James Fellow. He doesn't have a clue about William James' thinking on this issue, as far as I can tell. And I hope to get to talk to him one of these days, even give this lecture in William James Hall. My goal for this lecture. This is a practice run. Okay, Heisenberg wrote in Nature a two-stage model of random behavior plus lawful behavior put together, okay? I'll come back to that a lot more. But then I wrote a letter, I contacted Martin Heisenberg, told him William James, this was William James' idea. He said, Bob, wonderful to associate me with William James. Thank you, thank you. So he appreciated it. So I wrote a little letter to Nature, and they published my first philosophical publication, which says that William James thought of this idea 125 years ago. So I've taken that step to get James' reputation out there. And I will do it again in Barcelona in October, because we're going to have what's called an experts meeting there of 4 scientists, 4 philosophers, and 4 kind of commentators, intellectuals, on the subject, is science compatible with our desire for freedom? And 4 of the 5 leading thinkers on the 2-stage model will be there, including Bob Kane, Al Mealy, Martin Heisenberg, and myself. Only Dan Dennett of Tufts, who, as I said, I was one of the early ones to describe it but not endorse it, will be not there. But he will do a free will seminar at Tufts this fall, and he's invited me to come. So I'm going to sneak William James in into the Tufts students' heads. Bob Kane, by the way, is the leading free willist. Al Mealy is officially agnostic on the question of free will. Maybe that's why Templeton gave him the money. Okay, I'm asking you today, I put a paper into William James Studies in the recent edition, Volume 5. I want to thank Mark Moeller, wonderful editor of William James Studies, who worked with complaints from reviewers that said, how does he know William James did this? And they urged me to prove that James was first. And I spent a lot of time working on that. You're going to see my research on how I thought I could prove James was first. Okay, but I need more help, and I'm hoping that you will join me in whichever way you can to add some scholarship to James and his colleagues, okay? So who else would it have been before James? It could have been way back at the time of the Greeks, Epicurus and Lucretius. I don't think anyone after Newton established the laws of determinism could have thought of such an idea until Darwin, because he had to introduce chance. The whole sense of Darwinian evolution is that there are spontaneous, undetermined variations, mutations in the genes, which he didn't call them genes because he didn't know that yet, but he did have spontaneous variations followed by natural selection. Okay? Charles Sanders Peirce. Until the Royce James Symposium 3 years ago, I thought Peirce was closer to having an idea of chance being important. And so my discovery of James is really only 3 years old. I want to show why Peirce did also accept chance, but that he was no William James, although he's a great scientist, logician, and other things. Charles Renouvier and Alfred Fouillet, the great French thinkers, known influences on both Peirce and James, talked about free will. But I'm going to try to convince you they thought about it the same way Kant thought about it, as a kind of an antinomy where they could argue both for and against, or the classic pragmatic answer, yes and no. But I'm going to try to settle on the yes side. So I'll discuss them. They're known influences. So Epicurus, famous for saying his colleague Democritus had said the world was made up of atoms, material particles which are all going in determined ways, and basically created the problem of determinism. Epicurus said, well, maybe every now and then one of the atoms swerves a little. And all he really wanted to do was break the chain of determinism. Not that he thought chance made us free, but we have very few of Epicurus' works. I have all of them on my website. I have them in Greek. I have them in English. I taught myself Greek, or Holly and I took a few years of Greek to read Greek, did Hebrew as well to read the original sources. And they basically only could make room for freedom. They never really addressed the question, if it was random, how could that make us responsible? The Stoics had said chance was atheistic, and Chrysippus is the most famous, saying what later James would say, they would all fall apart. I have a very long article on free will in antiquity, which I won't bother you with today, but there are many of the important people. So now, could Darwin himself seen this? After all, he's the first one to tell us. Some chance variations, and then interesting things come out sometimes. Bob Richards, Robert Richards, not to be confused with Bob Richardson. Robert Richards I learned about from a paper, a reference in Jim Kloppenberg's book Uncertain Victory, wrote a paper. Gene Taylor has stepped out, but Gene Taylor and Robert Richards were 4 of the young scholars of the William James Renaissance that the Harvard Library Bulletin published in 1982. It was Richards' first look into the relationship between James and Darwin. And what Richards has told me, I've corresponded with him, is Darwin, he says, would not have liked what James was doing with it because his model of the mind was deterministic pattern manager like Huxley. And he was working on the biology part, not the mental part. So, but, says Richards to me, James couldn't have known this since Darwin's mental stuff was only written in the private notebooks and they were not available to William James at that time. So I think we can cross off Darwin, and I thank the editors for insisting that I find this evidence. I'm saying couldn't have been before Darwin, couldn't have been during Newton, couldn't have been even in the ancients, a complete view like we're going to see from William James. So what about the 2 great Frenchmen? Renouvier had published over several years wonderful books called Général Critique essays, and they were inspired by Kant, and they were very Kantian. But Kantian, as you know, solutions are generally both this and that, like Hegelian solutions. And there was an important difference where Kant put freedom in the noumenal realm, the kind of Swedenborgian other world that corresponds, a mental-only realm. Renouvier did bring it into the phenomenal world, and he said absolute chance is a requirement. So he's a step towards William James and two-stage models, but he doesn't yet see, you can't let the chance get into the decision. So his proofs of liberty and free will turn out to be formal antinomies, he says. They can be used to show or not show any case. So I leave it to you to see that he really didn't have James' practical thinking that chance must be limited to the alternative possibility generation. Now, Fouillé had a similar book. I had the pleasure of looking in the Fouillé book and finding William James' marginalia on the important sections of what he, I'm sure, learned from Fouillé. No problem about that. Fouillé influenced both of our great thinkers in America, Peirce and James James' personal copy that I've studied, thanks to work of Gene Taylor, who found that Alice Gibbons had given all of James' 17,000 books or some great number to Harvard, and Harvard librarians had put them in the general collection. And there they were until Gene Taylor and others started to notice, my gosh, we've got James thinking on all manner of writers and philosophers. And so they began a 5-year attempt to get all the books back and put them in Houghton, where we're going to see a large number of them tomorrow. Okay, so Fouillé wasn't at all specific about how chance could help, and I think I can rule him out.